What's up guys, welcome to the course. This is the course introduction where we discuss the course objectives and how you can make the most of this course. So what are the objectives of this course? The key objective here is to explore non-standard lines through a theoretical lens. When translated, that means we're going to be using a solver, GTO Plus, to analyze lines that many players may consider as non-standard. They perhaps don't use those lines, but then it turns out that theory perhaps does use those lines at a fairly high frequency, especially in specific situations. Simple example could be donk bet flop. Many players go through their entire career never donk betting the flop, but when we run theory models on flop donk bet, we see there are situations where it's correct for the defender to donk bet with a very high frequency. But it's one thing to understand whether these lines exist in theory and in what situations. In this course, we'll also discuss whether these lines should be used in practice. Okay, theory says we should use these lines. Should we actually incorporate them into our game? Do we need to make any adjustments before we do this? The overall objective here is to expand your range of available options and also to encourage use of less standard lines. So rather than automatically checking to the pre-flop aggressor or automatically always firing a 1/3 pot continuation bet in a 3-bet pot, you will have a range of options at your disposal and you'll be able to select the option which generates the highest expectation. Throughout all of this, there is an advantage to using less frequently used lines, and that's simply that our opponents won't know how to defend against them as accurately. Our opponents are used to facing 1/3 size continuation bets on the flop. They do it all day, every day. Their defending strategies are at least reasonable against those high frequency lines. As soon as we start using lines that our opponents don't see as much, for example, we'll discuss lines such as flop over bets and turn over bets in this series. When our opponents see less standard lines, they're going to be making more mistakes when facing those lines. In other words, we automatically get a benefit when we use lines that are less frequently used in general, because our opponents are going to be playing worse against those lines. So the objective here of the course is not just to expand your range of available options, but to encourage you to actually deliberately go out of your way to make use of less standard lines at the poker tables. Now, we mentioned that we're going to be making use of GTO Plus, the poker solver, in this course. And alongside this course, there will be a selection of pre-solved numbered GTO Plus grids available for download. Now, it's optional whether or not you take advantage of this extra resource. You don't have to download the GTO grids. You could just watch the training videos, and they are going to be very beneficial for you. But it's recommended if you also download the GTO Plus models and run them alongside watching this course. The only thing this will do is make you a stronger player with a deeper understanding of the theory concepts discussed in this course. Now, you might be thinking, do I have the system resources to load these trees? Because I know that GTO Plus is a poker solver and requires a large amount of RAM. That is true if you are running solves. All you need to do is load a pre-solved tree. If it's pre-solved, that means you can already see all of the output for the tree. You can browse the tree. So you don't need a large amount of RAM for downloading and importing these trees into your GTO Plus. However, if you do have the system resources, it's recommended that based on what you learn in this series, that you run some additional GTO Plus models outside of the scope of what we do in the series. For example, we may run a GTO Plus model in a specific formation and simply analyze that one formation. But you have the ability to run that same tree in a different formation with slightly different preflop ranges. It's only going to expand your understanding of the theoretical concepts at work here. We'll also be making some references to population data. So when we extract a GTO value, we might compare that to what the pool is doing in order to determine whether we should follow the GTO strategy or whether we should deviate when playing against the player pool. Now, once again, this is all completely optional. These are just recommended ways in which you can improve the upgrades you make to your game after watching this training course. So the first thing you can do is build relevant stats for your HUD setup. Give you a simple example. In the course, we referenced the need to have a fold to 4-bet jam stat on your HUD. So many players have a fold to 4-bet stat, but they don't have a fold to 4-bet jam stat. When you reach the relevant part of the course, you'll see why it could be useful to have a fold to 4-bet jam stat. Now, you could just take that on board as information. Okay, great. We should ideally have a fold to 4-bet jam stat, and then you could move on. Or you could say, well, the video series recommends that we create a fault to 4-bet jam stat. I'm actually going to fire up my tracker, create a fault to 4-bet jam stat, and then try and use that in game to generate exploits against my opponents. So it's recommended that based on what you learn in this training series, you actually build relevant stats for your personal HUD setup. And also, if you have the right software for it, it's recommended to run relevant range research reports to analyze pool tendencies. We will be looking at pool data in this series, but it won't be specific to your player pool. To get the best data here, if you have the ability, it's recommended to run your own range research report so you can compare your own specific pool data to the GTO values we uncover in this training series. Now, it's one thing to understand concepts on a theoretical level, but we're talking about lines that you may not have used before in game. And the best way you're going to get familiar with those lines is not purely by understanding on a conceptual level how these lines work, but experimenting with these lines in a real game scenario. So it's recommended that you actually do that after watching a video in the course or after watching a part of the course. You actually hit the tables, you experiment, you look for situations where the lines we've covered in the training course can be implemented, and you go out of your way to actually implement those lines in order to pick up experience playing in perhaps what many might consider a non-standard part of the game tree. What we find with many of the lines that we'll look at in the course is that although they're considered non-standard lines, they actually may be used by theory at quite a high frequency. In other words, these are overlooked parts of the game tree we'll be considering, which are absolutely going to be relevant for win rate if utilized in the right way. After watching this course, you may even have a preference for deliberately preferring lines that are used less commonly because you know your opponents are going to be making more mistakes against those lines, which allows us to generate a higher win rate overall. So with that in mind, thanks very much for checking out this intro, and I look forward to catching you guys in the rest of the course.